Good afternoon, guys. Dr. Ken Nordberg here with another fireside hunting seminar. And this is I keep saying this every time I put together a seminar for you guys. This thing is really important. You know, in my last few seminars, we've looked at the big picture to start with. You know, we started out, well, here's a woods out here. And we want to hunt big bucks out there. And we went through explaining where all the deer are out there, and take a typical square mile, and the dominant breeding bucks and the non-breeding bucks. And we ended up, the last time I talked to you, showing you how I find hideaways of non-breeding bucks while breeding is in progress, because that we're looking for 60% of the bucks that live in the area. They're all hiding somewhere because the dominant breeding buck is dangerous now. He's chased all those lesser antlered bucks out of his home / breeding range, because he wants no competition. You guys, you got to get out of here. And most of those older bucks, they've been through that before, so it's, whereas they'd sure love to be able to breed some does, they've learned the hard way that it doesn't pay to try to interfere with does and heat while with the big buck, the big dominant buck, or with them, because he's especially aggressive. His testosterone levels are really high. And I've known some dominant breeding bucks that were able to kill 10-pointers during this period that dared to get close to a doe and heat. So they are truly dangerous. We'll show you some pictures sometime about, the pecking order of bucks in a square mile. It's usually set up by mid-October, but we'll get to that sometime. But anyway, we got figured out where all these deer are. You got a general idea of what happens out there during hunting season because of what goes on during the whitetail rut. There's 5 stages. All kinds of things keep happening, and they change with each phase. And so it's kind of hard to hunt older bucks during this period for the reasons you already know about. And so we made maps and showed you specific little areas, these little half-acre hideaways. Some of them are a little larger, and what to look for. Well, how you know that happens to be a hideaway of a non-breeding mature buck. So now you know how to recognize them. Now the next thing, and probably even more important now that you know how to find these places, whether it's a stand site or an area to hunt a dominant breeding buck, a big trophy class buck, or a non-breeding, which can be trophy class as well. But now we're down to the point where exactly where are you going to sit, where are you going to stand hunt to get that buck in these areas now. And as I mentioned last time, there are a number of characteristics that make a stand site a mature buck effective stand site. Now, the average guys, they don't know about what I'm going to talk to you about today, and maybe you don't either. Maybe this is all Greek to you, but you want to learn it, and you've learned that so much of what I've taught really works. A lot of you guys have used what I've taught you and taken your first mature buck this last fall, and you're so happy about him, a lot of you. But this is the part that enables you to actually get the buck, being able to select mature buck effective stand sites. Now, in order to be a stand site like that, a lot of things, a lot of elements have to be there. And I actually got up at 4 o'clock this morning. I woke up at 4 o'clock and started thinking about what I was going to talk about today. And I was wide awake. I lay there for a half hour and gee, I'm not falling asleep. I might as well get up and and get ready for what I'm going to talk about today. And I created 3 pages of things that have to be there for a stand sight to be mature buck effective. And there are, well, how many categories have I got here? Almost 13 of them. Now, Dr. Nordberg, as an outdoor writer, is noted, you know, for 40 years I've been an outdoor writer, is noted for creating long sentences with about 6 different subjects in the same sentence. And the reason is that, you know, I'll start out with an idea, but there are always some things that modify it under certain conditions. It might be correct for, say, on October 20th, but not correct for November 20th, things like that. Different things are going on during the fall, during hunting seasons. So I'm always thinking about all these exceptions to the rule, and so my paragraphs can get to be really long. They're all associated things. So when I start reading this thing, now normally I don't read from a script, you know that. I've been doing that now for quite a long time now. I don't know how many of these seminars I've created, but I never used a script to talk about what I want to talk about. But today, you know, this morning I looked at these and I said, you know, I can't memorize these. You know, that's too much to memorize. So I'm going to start out reading from this paper. So I'm really covering everything, not missing a point, an important point for you, because I want you to know all this stuff. Now, another thing about that, you're going to see that, holy cow, there's so many things involved here. I said, I got 13 elements of a mature buck effective stand sight here, but each element has 4, 5, 6 different things in there that you need to know. Now, you know, even if you watch this thing, it's not like me. I've been doing this for 40 years. Even though I know exactly, you know, what to tell you, just when I sit down to make a seminar like this, I can forget some really important points, and this is one time I don't want to forget any of them. So that's why I'm going to start out every now and then. I'm going to read something from this sheet of paper. Now, the very first thing you need in your hunting area to be able to find, to be able to find mature buck effective stand sites that are going to be productive. You can find them, but they aren't going to be productive if you've got a lot of people hunting on foot in the area you hunt or making drives. And I know that might sadden a lot of you. Say, holy cow, they're making drives and this guy's walking all over the area where I used to hunt all the time. And this makes it sound like you don't have much of a chance to take a mature buck in that area because of that. And it's true. Now, I created a seminar a while back, I think about a year ago, about how to take older bucks in an area where hunting pressure is great, where there's a lot of hunters in the woods, things you should do to improve things. Well, in my case here in Minnesota, you know, we have a lot of public land. We got more than almost anybody in the eastern part of the United States, all the way out to the Mississippi River. Boy, we have a lot of public land. So if I decide there's too many hunters in this area, and I've had to do that once, and there's just too many hunters running around ATVs and using my tree stands and that kind of thing, we had to get out of there. So I can do it, but I can understand, you know, if you live in Virginia, like on the East Coast, chances are you're not going to even be able to hunt whitetails unless you belong to a hunting group and pay money, good money for that. And then when you go out and hunt with them, you get an assigned stand site and you got to sit there and they'll run dogs. And that's not really the way to hunt older bucks either. But if I was, you know, all the years I've been hunting bucks, you know, last 31 years, my boys and I and grandsons now, have been enjoying the best hunting, buck hunting of our lives. And if I couldn't have that anymore, you know, and this, not everybody can do that. I had moved to a different state where I could do it because that kind of hunting is so much fun. It's such a wonderful thing, you know, it's just so great to be able to hunt big bucks every year and to take one almost every year. And if I couldn't do that today, I'd move to whatever state I can think of where that would be possible, so I could continue that kind of hunting. But I know you can't. But check back to this. If you're having a problem with that, you know, hunting in a place where you don't have anybody wandering around on foot or making drives, check back on that one seminar about hunting older bucks where hunting pressure is great. So, anyway, I'll read the first sentence. Finally got to that. In order to have a mature buck effective stand sight that's going to be productive, no one should be wandering around on foot or making drives where you hunt in that area. The area should be only hunted by stand hunters who do two things, really important. The stand hunters who minimize human trail sense, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And B, that's A, minimize human trail sense, and B, avoid displaying hunting behavior, which is a wolf roost, and I've talked about that, while walking to and from stand sites or while scouting for brush signs made by mature bucks and does in heat during the hunting season. It's not just a matter of finding a stand site that's mature buck effective, but the hunter has to be different as well. You know, you've got to do those two things. You got to minimize trail sense, and that might not make sense to you right now, but it will in a little while. Or maybe in my next seminar. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get through all of this today, but we'll see. But you've got to minimize trail sense, and you've got to avoid displaying hunting behavior when you're walking to and from stand sites. That's absolutely essential. Otherwise, you're going to ruin the effectiveness of a buck stand site if you don't do those things. Those are so important. Okay, that's number one. Number two is you should always hunt within easy shooting distance of freshly made deer signs made by mature bucks. If you're going to hunt bucks, mature bucks, you got to hunt where they are. You can spend months in the woods, and if you aren't sitting where mature bucks are active today, and there's a lot to be able to, a lot you get to do to be able to do that, but if you are sitting where they're active are today, you may never see a big buck in the woods during the hunting season. You've got to be where they are today. But anyway, the stand was hunt within an easy shooting distance, you know. For a bow hunter, that probably means 20 yards of very fresh signs made by a mature buck. For a gun hunter, it might be 50 to maybe even 100 yards, but I never hunt in an area where you can shoot 100 yards very often. So 50 yards is usually, we shoot most of our bucks well within 50 yards where we hunt. But anyway, the kind of signs you're going to be looking for, and this is different now, you know. We use what a lot of guys call buck signs, antler rubs and ground scrapes, to find older bucks. But when it comes down to hunting during the hunting season, when we hunt while does are in heat, those don't mean beans, except on some very rare occasions. And then they really mean beans. But anyway, the standard must always hunt within the shooting distance of a freshly made deer signs made by mature bucks. And the signs are tracks. Now you know, by this time, if you've been watching my seminars, you know how to identify a big buck by the length of his tracks. Same with dropping tracks, droppings, beds, every day. these are everyday things that tell you where those bucks are active right now. Ground scrapes during the second half of October and sometimes in November under special circumstances. Or, you know, very fresh signs in or adjacent to current favorite feeding areas or watering spots. I've taken some bucks at watering spots over the years, some big ones. And also water spots of mature bucks or does in heat early and late in the day or in bedding areas or in or near bedding areas of does in heat midday. Now, that might seem confusing to you right now, but that's part of what you got to be able to. You've got to have fresh signs of a big buck in an area for a special reason. Now you can walk all over the woods, and maybe, you know, if you're in an area where you have a lot of whitetails, you could probably walk 30 yards and find tracks of a big buck or droppings of a big buck. Not necessarily fresh, they might be old, the droppings are dull, dried out, and the tracks are not very distinct, you know, in the dirt or snow or whatever. But you can find tracks and droppings of big bucks where you hunt, and then go another 30 yards and oh, here's another set just like that, but they're old. Old tracks and droppings are old news. They don't contribute at all to where you hunt big bucks on any one day during the hunting season. Very fresh droppings, to us Nordbergs, and we've learned this over the years. Gee, we've been doing this for 31 years now. Ordinarily, every day, every half day we hunt. Almost all of us, there are some times when it isn't that way, but almost all of us are going to be sitting near the edge of a feeding area that is a current favorite feeding area, and while does are in heat, a very favorite feeding area of does in heat, or of does in heat. Well, it's preferably if they're in heat, because if they're in heat, the big buck is going to be with them very shortly if it isn't with her already. That's what you want. And I've said this before, you hunt feeding areas because a feeding area with very fresh tracks on it is the most predictable place to see a big buck and other deer within the coming 24 hours or less. You know, you might find signs of a, well, let's talk about that. You might find signs of a doe in heat near that feeding area, in a trail that goes out into a feeding area. And what kind of signs would that be? Well, there's several. For one, if the doe peed in the snow, you'll see urine spotted with blood if it's in heat. If you find, you know, yellow urine in snow and it's got spots of blood in it, and sometimes there's quite a bit in there in that urine, that doe is in heat. That's a sign. And and then another sign would be a buck. Buck-sized tracks, say 3 3/4 to 4 inches long, tracks that big, where he's been dragging his hoofs from track to track in the snow. That's the buck under the influence of the pheromone being released from the urine of a real live doe. I'm going to say real live doe a lot because that isn't necessarily the case when you're using store-bought urine from a doe in heat. Because, as I mentioned last time, there's other scents that got to accompany that pheromone in the air to be attractive to a big buck nowadays. And those other scents are the scents that normally come from the body, and they're fairly strong scents. Sniff a doe next time, you know, sniff the fur, sniff its forehead, sniff, you know, parts of that deer, and there's strong odors coming off that deer. And if those odors aren't accompanying the odor of that pheromone, that buck isn't going to come to it as often now. And nowadays, they're wise to that. You know, if all they smell is the pheromone and human odors accompanying them, they know, well, I'm not going to mess around with that. That's a dangerous source of that pheromone. But anyway, that's a sign. Here's a buck dragging his hoofs, and for some reason they walk stiff-legged when they're smelling that pheromone, head down, their mouth is opening like they're swallowing air, and in the way they are swallowing air, up behind the upper gums here in the front, there's no teeth in the upper jaw of a whitetail, but there's a little hole up there, a space that has a channel going to the brain, and when that pheromone gets to the brain, it sets that buck up for breeding. You know, he'll respond to that pheromone in a way that he's ready to breed now, and so that's kind of important to the buck, and that's called a Flamon's response. This trying to get gulps of air, opening his mouth, curling his lip. You know, that's real common. You see that, boy, that buck is smelling it up, or he's dragging his tracks. Now, another sign is that here's these big tracks of a buck, and he may not be dragging his tracks all the time, but he might have been with this doe for half a day already, for 12 hours, and he isn't necessarily going to be dragging his tracks that whole 12 hours, or he isn't necessarily going to be dragging his hoofs from track to track all the time. You know, he might, if he's been with this doe for 12 hours, you know, already, he might be walking more normally, a little bit of dragging, but not as much as early when he first smells that doe. But here's a buck accompanying a doe. Here's 3-inch tracks of a doe, or a little smaller if it's a yearling doe, in the snow. Now, that buck is accompanying that doe because the doe is in heat, you see? So those are signs that here's a doe in heat, and that's really important. Now, the thing about does, and I mentioned it before, when they're in heat, it doesn't matter, it doesn't upset their schedule. They'll eat when it's time to eat. Normal hours when they feed, they'll be out there feeding, and the buck will be trailing the doe, and he may feed along with her, or he may not. He might not feel like feeding. He wants to breed. But when she wants to feed, she's all business. Most of the breeding goes on back in their bedding area midday. And they'll breed 3-4 times out there. But anyway, so when you find big buck tracks accompanying 3-inch tracks, that's a doe in heat. So those are things to watch for. And there's no more predictable place to take a doe or a big buck that's with a doe in heat than in the feeding area. You can be all over the woods, see, you know, here's a square mile, and you can spend all day in the wrong places. But if you spend your day in a feeding area, the favorite feeding area of a doe in heat, your odds of taking a big buck are about as good as they're going to be. That's where you're going to get the big buck. So you have to know how to identify feeding areas. That's going to be really important. Let's go on to some more tough to digest things here. We start talking about, well, breeding is in progress. The stand hunter should key on deer signs that reveal a doe is in heat, like blood spotted urine and snow, tracks of a buck dragging its hoofs from track to track in snow, revealing it's under the influence of airborne pheromone emitted from the urine of a real live doe, or tracks made by a mature buck accompanying tracks made by a mature doe or yearling bull in or adjacent to the doe's favorite feeding area. Or that early and late in the day, feeding areas early and late in the day, or midday in the doe's bedding area. So here's another case where you need to know where does bed, and doe bedding areas are large. You know, big bucks will bed in small areas, half-acre areas, but does, gee, they'll have bedding areas up to 10 acres in size, and they might be irregular in shape, and might even be 2 adjacent spots separated a little bit, maybe by some brush or something, but they're bigger on that because wherever they bed, what they're trying to do when they keep moving around in that bedding area is keep their fawn scents to a minimum in any one spot. If they just kept going, bedding in the same spot, pretty soon that bedding spot would be reeking with fawn odors, very attractive to wolves. And in our country, boy, our wolves are hell on fawns all summer long, so they're good at that. They want those fawns to live, so they keep moving around in there. So keep that in mind. But so you look for doe-sized beds out there, along with smaller beds made by fawns and yearlings that accompany the doe. The doe families are made up of a mature doe and her yearlings, which stay with her through their second year or yearling year, because that's the year that's most important for them to learn most of what they need to know to survive in the wilds on their own. And the fawn is just beginning his 2 years of being taught these things, so they're with them. So you find those kind of signs along with it. And beds, especially in deep grasses. Deep grass, does love to bed in deep grass because a fawn can just lay right down, and so can they, in the deep grass, and they're hidden. But usually in mixed timber, and there can be a lot of brush there, and a lot of mature trees as well as young trees, and it's just kind of a mixture of everything. And they use whatever bedding area is best for the day, like, where it's windy and it's warm, and the deer flies are after them. They want to be where there's some wind, or if it's cold, they want to be under the evergreens away from the frigid winds and snow and things like that, so it changes. But anyway, keep in mind though, you find a doe in heat, that doe is only going to be in heat for 24 to 26 hours. Every yearling doe and mature doe is only in heat for 24 to 26 hours, and they aren't all in heat on the same day. They're in heat over a 2-week period of time, different does. And so the point I'm making is the buck, big dominant breeding buck, that big trophy buck, is going to be with a doe in heat only 24 to 26 hours. Then it's going to be off looking for another one, which is easy, and he already might know of one already. He's already smelled the pheromone on the wind. Those bucks can smell does in heat a mile away. So anyway, he's off looking for another doe, or he's accompanying another doe. Sometimes the doe in heat, they don't just stand around waiting by a ground scraper or something like some manufacturers will have you believe. They'll go looking for that buck, and that buck stinks so badly, that big dominant buck, and all the musk odors coming up. They can smell him a mile away. So, well, if he doesn't show up soon, that doe will go looking for the buck. So it might be with a doe in heat, and pretty soon another one shows up, and so keep that in mind. When you find one, that's not forever. That's not, if you say, oh boy, here, I'm going to put a tree stand up here, because there's a doe in heat around here. And by the time you get that up, if they don't discover you before you even finish the job and start avoiding it, by the time you get done, maybe that doe is not in heat anymore. And it's gone. It's a mile away now with another doe in heat, or a half mile, or whatever. So that's finding a doe in heat is not forever. It's only good for 24 to 26 hours. And when you find it, there's no way of knowing exactly when that doe went in the heat, unless, like what happens quite often where we hunt. We scatter out. We all hunt different areas every day in my gang. And somebody will go out in the morning and maybe pass a certain distance near a doe bedding area. And all the tracks are normal. And then it's 11 o'clock and time to go back to camp and maybe walk on a cruise trail. I'll talk to you about that again before we're done here. And on the way back to camp, here's a doe. He finds doe urine with blood in it, or a buck who's been dragging his hoofs from track to track in the snow, or any of those other signs that we were talking about. Chances are that doe just started being in heat. And so you got 24 hours ahead of you, but most time you don't know how much time you got ahead of you. And we never count on, like if that happens to us, we know that doe, or we're almost certain that doe is going to be in heat during the next feeding cycle in the evening, starting, you know, maybe about 3 o'clock where you hunt in our area. They don't start until about 4 o'clock, an hour before it gets dark in the evening because of we're in wolf country. But anyway, it's going to be still in heat in that evening and tomorrow morning. And the nearest feeding area where you find these things is where they're going to be. And that's where your odds of taking a big buck are going to be especially good. Now, if you keep doing that, so the next day you go out and start doing that all over again, going to the same stand site or a different one near that feeding area, before the day's done, that doe is not going to be in heat anymore. And so you're wasting your time there. You should be at another spot where a doe is in heat. And this is the reason, especially while does are in heat, why you need to scout during the hunting season. And you have to do it in a way that doesn't alarm deer. Even better, without them even knowing you're doing it. So that's what you got to do if you're going to be serious about hunting big bucks during the hunting season. So anyway, now, next paragraph. A mature buck that walks on your tracks in snow. And I'll talk about that. And I've given you a seminar about that in the past, but more than once during the hunting season, a mature buck that walks in your tracks more than once during the hunting season, just once, that would mean that this buck is vulnerable. It just happened for the first time. But if he does it again, then you can be almost certain that buck has become accustomed to your passage on the trail, on a certain trail, like when you're going back and forth to a tree stand or a stand site somewhere. And you go early in the morning and you come back around between 11 and 12, and then you go out again about between 1 and 2 and come back after dark and evening. Well, that buck that walks on your tracks knows that's what you do. And if, when you're going to a stand site or coming back from it, you walk in a manner that doesn't alarm them, they're going to leave the area. So that buck will remain vulnerable to skilled stand hunting as long as it walks on your tracks. Now, the problem with that is I've learned, I keep learning. I learned it again 2 years ago. We had a buck during that. And I've learned that those doggone bucks that do that, it's the big ones, like this is the one with 4-inch tracks that was walking on our tracks. On tracks of mine and my son Ken and his wife with him. And the buck that does that is so skilled at identifying, discovering and identifying hunters and avoiding them that he got to be a big buck. He wouldn't be big if he wasn't good at it. He wouldn't still be alive. Yeah, he wouldn't be alive in the area you've been hunting for the last 4 to 6 years. He's 4 to 6 year old buck with tracks that large. He's survived all those hunting seasons. And so he's proven, boy, he's really good at avoiding hunters. And you have to be awfully good at being able to get close to a stand site along a trail where a buck has been walking on your tracks to take that buck. Now, I've taken some. I've taken one not so long ago, a few years ago, that I did get. And sometimes, rather than hunt along that track, I'll hunt the nearest feeding area, thinking that could be where this buck is feeding, especially if it's at a time when does aren't in heat, But anyway, you have to be awfully good at it. And so when you find that, don't think this buck is going to be a pushover. And you have to be kind of lucky, because sometimes you know that buck is bedding in an area where he can see you, or hear you, or smell you going by. And as long as you're walking at a moderate pace, non-stop, picking up your feet, moving along fairly quietly, and not stopping to look around and see if a buck is around, whether it's daylight or night, because they can see at night as well as by day. But anyway, as long as you're not acting as if you're hunting when you go by, you just go, and you've been doing this every day for not only this year, but last year and the year before, walking on this trail. He's not going to be concerned about you. He'll just almost ignore you. And then he'll walk on that trail when he knows it's going to be safe to do that, you see. But anyway, it's so tempting to hunt a buck that's doing that, and sometimes it works. And so I urge you to do it, but boy, don't expect success every time on a buck like that. And but sometimes it works, and when you do, you're a pretty happy hunter. So keep that in mind. Now, the odds of taking mature bucks on well-used deer trails. Now, the average hunter, every deer hunter knows, the hunter has never hunted before. You walk out in the woods and holy cow, this must be a deer trail. Look at all the deer tracks in this trail here. And a lot of hunters, what they look for is they say, oh man, look at this one. There's no grass anymore. It's all kicked up, all dirt, just in there. This trail is really being used a lot by deer. And boy, this is a trail to get a buck. They're imagining all kinds of deer walking down this trail, including a great big buck, and they're going to get that. But that is often not the case. And the reason is, almost all deer trails are created by doe families, a mature doe with a couple yearlings, and maybe a couple fawns. And wherever they go every day, this small herd of deer keeps walking on this trail, and pretty soon there's no grass growing on it. And you get out there, and even in the wintertime, there's all kinds of black dirt kind of kicked up on it, snow on each side, and you say, oh man, look at this trail here, I gotta hunt here. Because boy, deer are really using them. Now, problem with deer trails or doe trails as far as bucks are concerned, most deer trails, especially in the country where we hunt, are tunnels. Tunnels through dense cover, a lot of dense cover. The average doe is only going to be about 36 inches tall at the shoulders, and maybe 18 inches wide, your ears going out a little bit wider than that. And some of those big fat does will be maybe up to 2 feet wide. But the tunnels they create with the passage of their bodies are too small for big bucks with wide antlers that stick out wider than their ears. They get in there and hooking brush and having all kinds of trouble. And because of that, most trails that big bucks use, especially in the last half of October when they're making antler rubs and groundscapes to mark their breeding range, or to mark the home ranges of does that they expect to breed. This is my doe, and I'm marking this, and the rest of you bucks stay away from here. And that's what groundscapes and antler rubs are all about. They're visual and signposts that are no trespassing signs to other bucks. And all the antler bucks do that, even yearling bucks. But by the end of October, that big buck has chased all those other bucks out of his breeding range, and then a lot of those signs like antler rubs or groundscapes aren't being renewed, and the only ones that are those made by the big dominant breeding buck. But those trails, those are trails the buck's going to use, and because they're easier to walk on. These are what you would call a major deer trail out in the woods. Look at this big wide trail, it's all pockmarked with deer track. It's liable to be a scrape trail. It may not be, but it might be. It depends on the buck. He might think, oh, this is a trail I got to mark. So the other bucks know this is my doe here. Well, anyway, but whenever you're scouting, it doesn't matter when it is, spring, like I like to do early spring, soon as snow melts, and I'll be out there this spring. Heaven help me. Whenever you scout, when you see a deer trail, it's not just a deer trail. And what I mean is, if you're going to be hunting big bucks, the only trails that should excite you are trails that have tracks of big bucks on them. Most of those well-used deer trails made by and maintained by doe families, on most of those, you won't find any tracks longer than about 3 inches. That's it. If you find a trail like that and there's just 3-inch tracks, there's no tracks bigger, there's no like 3 3/4 or 4-inch tracks on there, don't get excited about it. Now, if it's a scrape trail, in the last half of October and the first few days of November, there are going to be big buck tracks on it. The tracks made by the biggest buck in your hunting area. But they'll be 3 3/4 to 4 inches in length, those, you know, the hoof only, not including dew claw measurement. But they'll be on there, and there'll be droppings on there. 3/4 of an inch long and sometimes a little longer, shiny ones, clumped. Droppings kind of stuck together and fall apart a little bit when they hit the ground, but the clumped droppings like that will be on that trail. And then if the ground scrape has been freshly renewed, dirt, leaves, and turf is kicked way over there, and moss, 10, 20, boy, you get late in October and into the breeding phase of the rut. If occasionally a buck will renew a ground scrape then, but just occasionally, not often. But under certain circumstances they will. But at any rate, when you see that dirt all over the snow, just, it looks like it was just made minutes ago or renewed minutes ago, then boy, that trail is an important one to hunt. Whether it's in October, last half of October, or even while breeding is going on in November. Like I say, you won't find many of those, but when you do, that's a dynamite trail to hunt. But anyway, or stand hunt. So, keep that in mind. If you're hunting bucks, doesn't matter what the trail looks like, unless there are tracks. And sometimes you'll find trails like that with all kinds of tracks of a big buck. The big buck is using this trail all the time. Or the only tracks you'll find on the trail are those of big buck. And quite often, when you'll find some trails, just a faint little thing, it's almost all grown in with little trees and hazels right up to the trail, going off into the woods. But it's still a trail that's visible. And you go over and check that, maybe the only tracks you'll find on a trail like that are those of a big buck. Maybe because this is his bedding area is where he's going when he uses that trail. Well, the bedding areas of big bucks don't have many deer trails on them. It's an area that's all thick. And we talked about how it can be an awful place to walk. You don't want to go there. But big buck tracks on a trail are the kind of trails you want. Forget lots of doe tracks and that. You aren't likely to see a doe there unless those buck tracks are there. Hey guys, you know, as you see, you know, I digress now because there are different things happening during different periods in hunting seasons at the same place or not the same place. There's lots of things I keep interjecting because they're important to the subject. So don't get lost. Here we are now. Here's number 6 in this list. And this might be the last one for this seminar. I think there's going to be 2 seminars the way it looks. But this is really an important one, and you're going to see. Now, I'm going to ask my son John behind the camera to swing his camera on. I'm going to walk over in front of that window, and I want him to swing it over there, and I'll just stand there for a minute, and then I'll come back and sit down. Now then, what you saw is the appearance of a human body in front of a bright sky or a snowy background. And it's almost black. But there's no doubt it's a human. And when a deer sees something like that, a silhouette like that in the woods against the sky, like a hunter up in a tree, it's against the sky, and if that silhouette is clearly a human, it can't be a bear, they're in hibernation already. There's no bird that big. It's a big thing up there, and that's what a human looks like up there. Whether he's sitting or standing, it's a human up there. And big bucks today are everywhere. They can look up there and they see that big dark thing up in a tree or over there against a snowy background. There's no doubt in their mind that's a human. Now, you know, they're not particularly afraid of stand hunters as long as they're not close to them. So, but you are so easy to see and identify against a bright sky or snowy background during the hunting season. Way over there. I mean, they can look at you from a half mile, from 400 yards, I know that. I've had that happen. Big buck spotted me before I spotted the big buck 400 yards away because they moved. They can spot you as, oh, that's a hunter, whether you're up in a tree or on the ground. That black, and it doesn't matter what, you could be wearing a $300 camel suit of any kind, but against a sky like that, bright sky, or a starlit sky for that matter, at night, or a snowy background, you would recognize a human yourself anywhere in that situation. That's a human, that's a hunter over there. The big bucks do that too. Now, yearlings and fawns aren't good at that. But most whitetails, including does, that are 2.5 years of age or older, and all bucks that are 3.5, well, 4.5 to 6.5 years of age, and few live longer, they readily recognize you that far away, great distances away. So keep that in mind. Now, here's a wonderful artistic picture of a hunter sitting on a stool here. See him here? He's sitting on a stool with his rifle across the line up there. And now, if there's a snowy hill behind it, or all kinds of brush and stuff plastered with wet snow, you know, snowy background, or if he's sitting up in a tree on a portable stand, let's see, the portable stand, that figure there turns all black, and it's easy to spot way over there. And if it moves, it's especially easy to spot. If there's any movement going on up there, the hunter standing up to take aim or look for a scope, which is kind of silly. You should always shoot from a sitting position, or whether you're using a gun or a bow. Bows aren't 6 foot long anymore. But these little compound bows, you don't have to stand up to shoot those. You'll always be more accurate sitting anyway. Which you'd find out if you did that. When you go to a range, sit on a chair and shoot and see how much more accurate you'll be. But anyway, that figure will turn black, an easy spot, especially if it moves. Well, it doesn't matter where you sit, on the ground level or up the tree. Nowadays, if you're going to hunt big bucks, you've got to have excellent concealment. You know, it wasn't that way back in the 1960s. When I was using primitive platforms before tree stands were even known. But during the 70s, when my kids started hunting, and we were building permanent stands, which were legal out in the woods, you didn't have to be any higher than 6 feet off the ground. And you could have deer walking right next to you, you could reach out and touch them if you want, or feeding and even laying down right next to where you're in the stand. And they wouldn't see you, they wouldn't identify you. Upwind or downwind, they wouldn't identify you. It was really amazing how close they could be. And back then, hunters believed that, gee, when you're up off the ground, they can't identify you. And it seemed that way for sure. But by the late 1980s, they were starting to prove that just isn't the case. They were learning to look for hunters in elevated stands. And learning that when they smell one and can't see him on the ground, then he must be up in the tree around here somewhere. You know, upwind or downwind. He's downwind, but upwind is smelling one. And they'd be looking. I got all kinds of pictures of big bucks looking up in trees. And because I deliberately made a noise so my wife Jean could take a picture of that buck looking at me up in the tree. They look up there all the time. So what do you need when you're hunting a buck? Now, if you're hunting yearling bucks and fawns, you know, if you want to take those, you don't need to do this. But if you're going to hunt older deer, even older does, today things are a lot different than they were many years ago when tree stands were first introduced to hunters. Those old stories don't apply to buck hunting today, not at all. And you can be 20 feet up in the air on a ladder stand, the new ones now, and they'll still see you up there. You know, it's the same dark silhouette. And when you're down there downwind, maybe they have to be 50 yards downwind to smell you when you're that high, instead of 25 yards away when you're down lower. But they're still going to smell you, and they're still going to see you, and especially if you move when you're up there. Same with bear hunting. So what do you need? Well, first of all, you need a solid background. You know, there's lots of solid backgrounds in the woods, but up where we hunt, there are a lot of evergreens. And boy, you get a bunch of evergreens, you know, where, there we go. You get a bunch of evergreens, and behind you, or maybe a lot of big tree trunks, or thick brush, or a big boulder, you know, it could be a boulder, you know, like that. That's number one. I've always felt, and for a long time I always felt, that you gotta have a solid background. And when you have a solid background behind you, your body isn't black against a snowy background or the sky. Now, it's a lot harder to have a solid background in a tree stand. And the higher you get, the more difficult it becomes. But you gotta still, up there, you still gotta have a solid background. Now my son Dave has become really good at finding spots for tree stands close to feeding areas that where doe is in heat right now today for a number of years now, and he's been really good at it. Yeah. John is going to put a picture up for you right about now on the screen, showing you a buck's eye view of Dave's tree stand from which he shot the buck. And for the last couple of years now he's done that. And you can't see the tree stand. And with Dave up there, you can hardly see him, maybe some of his head, and that's about it. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But you've got to have a solid background. Now, where we hunt, there are usually a lot of big aspens. You know, they have rough trunks, you know, and they don't provide a whole lot of cover, but they're wonderful trees for portable stands. You can climb those almost silently, getting up there, big strong things, and get your stand up there and hooked up to the tree and a seat up there. But one thing about tree stands is you got to climb up there. And if you don't have cover to mask you, so you can't be seen while you're climbing up there and getting into your stand, that's just like saying, hey you guys, hey you deer, here I am, hey look at me walking up there, maybe making a little scraping noises on the rough bark of that tree, and they see you go up there and you sit on up there. And you know, years ago, here's another picture. Here's a picture of my son Ken preparing a spot for his portable stand for bow hunting. And look at that dark silhouette against the sky, but he's got all the branches taken off the tree, everything down below there, and in an evergreen tree, so there's no branches, nothing providing cover up there, and he's standing on it, and look at that dark silhouette. And people are still doing that. They figure, oh, I can go up here 10, 20 feet. They won't see me. That's a lie today. Those big bucks certainly will see you. You're so easy to spot in a thing like that. But anyway, where we hunt, we have lots of aspens like that growing amongst evergreens that can provide. Here, like say, here's an aspen, and here's several evergreens all around the area. And boy, we like to use aspen trees for portable tree stands surrounded by evergreens. And we don't cut off all those branches up there at the stand level like they do, and still a lot of you still do it today, because you figure you want to be able to shoot in 360-degree circle all around stand, because you figure a buck might come from any direction. I want to be able to shoot over that way. Take everything off there so you can do that, or to see, you know, I want to be able to see way over there, and you're just naked up there when you do that. And that's terrible. And there's this big thing in the tree, and that thing up there, and that's a human. Every buck knows that. So when we make, nowadays when we put up tree stands, generally if we can, we'll put it in an aspen or some other tree, or maybe another evergreen, surrounded by evergreens that provide good cover all the way around. I remember many years ago in the late 80s, we were, you know, the bucks were starting to show us that they were spotting us in tree stands. And that was kind of a surprise when that started happening. We started nailing evergreen boughs around the platforms of our tree stands to hide the human silhouette up there. And that worked pretty good for a while. But then all of a sudden they decided we should not make permanent stands anymore. And so we had to start doing things differently. And so we had to be looking for really dense cover up there behind the area. That background has got to be solid with trees behind it, so your silhouette is hardly noticeable up there, especially if you're sitting very still. So background there, background here. But you need something in front too. When you're sitting on a stool out there, because you're going to have to move, sometimes you just want to stretch, you know, if you're sitting for a couple hours. Or here comes a buck, and oh geez, get the safety off and you start raising your rifle. That motion is easy for a buck to spot, even really slow, although not every time, unless you got good cover in front of you. So next thing you need is good cover in front of you as well. And for me, quite often, that really good cover in front, and actually on both sides of me, is tall grass, or hazels, lots of brush, or maybe there's a big evergreen right here and it's got boughs coming across where I'm sitting, and maybe one over here and more boughs coming across, and I'm looking out there. Or maybe it's up big tall and there's boughs coming this way and this way as well, and all I got is a little space here to look out. And or it's a fallen evergreen here, and the trunk, and you know, a newly fallen one, or a great big trunk, or sometimes several trees falling across, like my old Lonesome Pines extension. A huge old pine with a trunk about 3 feet in diameter fell, branches sticking up, and another one fell over this way, and boy, it was a natural blind. It was such a good blind. 10 yards back from the edge of a clear cut, when they're out back in the woods like that and they're completely natural, they are good blinds. You're going to see deer there. You may not see all over the whole clear cut like a lot of hunters prefer to do, but when you do see them, they're right there. You know, they're so close. And so anyway, you need cover in front of you to hide your body and the motions you're going to make. Whether you're on the ground or up in the tree, you want some cover in and around you. I love sitting in a tree with evergreens in that tree or around me that come across the front of me. I don't cut all those off. When I'm sitting up there, this is what you see. And I swear, sometimes I think when a buck sees that head of mine, you don't know what it is. You think maybe it's a porcupine or maybe a grouse. And there's a reason for that. Because I haven't hunted whitetails for, I don't know how long, for more than 30 years, for sure, without wearing a camel head net, like this one. There's a elastic band that goes around the back of my neck. Oh, this way. You know what? Most of the time when I put it on in the morning, I don't take it off when I'm heading in and out from my tree stand. I'll roll this up, but there's a cap on top. And you know, during the gun season, it better be blaze orange. In my case, I wear camel blaze orange clothing and camel blaze orange cap. But here I am like this. Now, if the sun is shining toward me, my glasses might send flashes of light down there where the deer are standing, which will certainly get the deer's attention. In that case, I want to be behind the mesh, and this mesh you can look right through it like the screens on your house. You know, you can look out there and it looks almost clear through that screen. Same with this. So no flashes of light coming toward the deer. So when I'm up there, they don't see a bright, shiny face or a white beard. No exposed skin. Your exposed skin is so bright against natural backgrounds, you know, and if it moves, oh, there's a human. The only creature in the woods the whitetails know that has bright skin like that are humans, you know. And here's one hiding over there, waiting in the ambush, you know. And boy, you know, so right away they know you got to stay away from there. Now, you know, and then there's a camel blaze orange cap, and you see, you disappear. And to go further, even in warm weather, I wear gloves. And those are bright, shiny things against the natural background as well. And you know what things, seeing those hands come up like when you're bringing up your bow or your gun. So I always wear, at least very light gloves. In fact, I wear gloves like this during winter camping too until it's like 10 below zero, and I gotta wear pretty much warmer things. But anyway, no bare skin. I am now disappeared. I can now raise my gun or bow behind that cover in front of me real slowly, and they won't see it. And get up there and take aim. One of the biggest bucks I ever took in recent years, well, one of the biggest bucks, not ever, but one of the biggest bucks I took in recent years, suddenly showed up about 25 yards away to rub scalp musk on boughs of an evergreen overhanging its ground scrape, just right over there. And there I was sitting there, you know, and I found that in the dark. I said, holy cow, that's a freshly made ground scrape. And that was in November, one of those special circumstances. Anyway, when that happened, I was pretty excited. He's rubbing, you know, and he's kind of snapping branches up there on that bough, and I couldn't believe it. He was kind of broadside to me when he was doing that. And his head was up there, and I brought my gun up, and I was looking through there, and said, you know, I didn't wait to really look to see if I had any interference from brush in front of me. And pow, I shot. And he turned his head, he looked my way, nothing happened. Oh, crap, I thought there must have been something. The trouble with the 7mm Magnum, they ricochet so easily off of intervening branches, even little ones, or they explode and don't even touch the deer. And I've had that happen several times over the years. Otherwise, I love the cartridge. When you hit them properly, boom, they go right down like a giant fly swatter. I hit them and no suffering, the most humane shot imaginable. But I thought, oh, I can't believe it. 25 yards away and I didn't hit that thing. So he was looking right at me and that's all he was looking at. That's all he could see. And so I very carefully opened the bolt of my gun, drained it silently, opened it about 2/3 of the way. I didn't want to go beyond that because if I pulled it all the way back, the next shell, the empty cartridge would make a noise and would even go flying out and go, maybe hit branches on the way down, and the one coming up from the magazine would go click. I didn't want any of that, so about 2/3 of the way. So then I took that empty cartridge out of there, you know, a little bit forward to get it released from the bolt, and take it out, and then reach in my pocket on my coat right there. I always keep a couple extras in there. Take that out, and all the while that buck was looking at me. And I'm sure he saw some whoosh in there, and he's trying to figure out what is that, you know. And meanwhile, I ease the bullet into the chamber and then push that bolt forward really careful, and then the bolt handle down, and then I'm going to come back here and to get the safety off without that buck hearing it. I have to use, when they're that close, I got to use 2 thumbs, one on each side of the tang, and push it backward. And if I don't do that, it's going to click. And so get it back without a click. And all this going on, all the while he's just looking at me. And then I raise my rifle really slow, and I get up there, and I pointed at him and said, holy man, no wonder that bullet didn't get to the buck. Look at all that junk there. So then I started leaning to the side, and leaning and leaning and leaning. Oh, here, I got an opening to that buck's neck. And right to the bottom of his white throat patch. And he's looking right at me, so shoot there, it goes through the spine, and you know, no doubt about that. So squeeze the trick, pow, disappeared. Didn't hear a sound, no deer running or anything. And I sat there for a few minutes, and I couldn't wait anymore. I got up, walked over, and there he was, laying right there in his ground scrape. I couldn't have done it if I wasn't wearing a camel head net and gloves, and if I didn't have proper concealment, adequate concealment around me. Couldn't have done it, ever. And by the way, I was leaning back against a big poplar tree here, and there's evergreens all around, and the brush just full of hazels here, really thick. And I had everything I needed, and 25 yards away, that deer didn't know what the heck I was, and I got it because of that. I'll tell you, a camel head net is magic. When you start using one, you won't believe, and you have proper concealment, you won't believe how many deer are going to walk right by you within 10 yards and never know you're there. You're going to have does and fawns feeding right in front of you, and sometimes, you know, here's a buck coming, and John had one only 3 feet away. And he shot through a range of 3 feet from his ground level stand, because he had proper concealment. You gotta have that concealment, whether you're on the ground or in a tree. That is so important. And you gotta cover that bright skin and white beard You got to get that covered when you're out there. And if you do that, you're going to start seeing bucks. And, get that silhouette hidden and get that and hide your skin and hide your movements. And it's so easy to find good concealment at ground level. Where we hunt, boy, you can, in a half-acre area or around it, you could probably find 20 spots that are good. Take the one that you're going to use, like say, I'm expecting a south wind on opening morning, so I'm going to go in there early morning, and I'm going to be on the north end, sitting in one like that, sitting in a spot like that, and I'll get them. And you will, if you don't get too nervous. Okay, gang, this subject is taking longer than I imagined it would, but there's much more to talk about. So we'll save the rest of it for another seminar soon. And can't wait to get to the rest of this still. Now, you see, you're getting an idea when you're hunting big buck. Now, you learn all, here's big woods and here's where you hunt and why and that kind of thing. But the nitty-gritty part is where you hunt, where you sit. And you gotta sit at certain spots. So we're gonna talk a lot more about what makes a certain spot mature buck effective next time. Meanwhile, gang, how are you gonna remember all this? I mean, even if you've got these saved on your computer or even a tablet, bring it out the deer camp with you. You're going to want this book because you won't remember all the things I told you today. You're going to miss something, and if you miss some of any of these things, like the head net, for example, or the kind of cover you're going to have nowadays to take big bucks, if you miss any of that, your odds of taking a big buck aren't going to be very good. You've got to do all these things. You're going to become an expert. Really hard for whitetails to avoid because of your expertise. And gee, that's fun hunting when you can do that. No, your days in tree stand aren't near as boring, and all the wildlife you see and other deer and that kind of things while you're out there. It's so much more fun and exciting when you do it right. So with that, get your book. Do that soon, and you'll be forever glad you got it, really. And I've been getting a lot of orders from wives of hunters lately. And maybe they wanted it for Christmas, but they couldn't afford it. And the kids going to school, they got to buy all the stuff that kids need to go to school, and car payments and house payments and all that. Have to put that off a little bit, but when you can swing it, get your book, because you're going to be forever glad. Long after I'm gone, you're going to be using this book all your life. You bet. Okay. Now, before you check off here, please, you guys, I almost beg you, subscribe. That's easy to do. It only takes a minute or two. And there's things that are good for you when you do that. And then also check that thumbs up button there down below here. And that's important too. Please do that as well. And if you do those kind of things, well then I've done my job as a speaker for you. And I'm going to be around a while on YouTube as long as I can. But there's a lot more to learn, believe it or not. But anyway, with that, thanks for watching again, and don't miss my next YouTube presentation. It's more of this kind of thing that you need to know. So, we'll see you again soon. Be sure to visit my website. Here's the link. Here you'll find links to my blog posts, my Twitter account, my YouTube account, my Amazon store with links to my ebooks, my son's eBay store, a money saver if you're ordering from Canada or other countries, my website bookstore, and much more.